of you for coming today through this weather. It is just incredible outside right now. I guess you might have missed the worst of it. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the book From Malgudi, which is an imaginary place, to Macondo, which is another imaginary place, as he will tell you. But it's an amazing book. And the best part is the chapter on football. And how he got tricked into supporting Boca Juniors. You know, I was sent to Manchester to study so I could back Manchester United, you know, for the last 50 years. So it's a bit like that. But Mr. Viswanathan, Ambassador Viswanathan, is just an amazing man. And his love affair, which became a marriage to Latin America, so he practices this is legally not allowed. He has 2 wives. One who's sitting here in the front row, Mrs. Viswanathan, and the other is Latin America. He can have, okay. And he's got some of his former colleagues from the Ministry of External Affairs here to give his approval for what he's been doing. But this is a great story. He'd tell us something about it. And if you go to his website and read his bio about how he used to walk miles to go to school, how he managed to persuade his elders to allow him to go to college, it's just a fascinating story. And one of these days, ministry permitting, you might actually be heading back that way to Latin America, where he wants to live and where he wants to work. So he continues to be a lifetime ambassador for us to Latin America. I don't know whether some of your colleagues, former colleagues, will approve of that, because you'll be hanging around there creating a nuisance. But it's great that you will. And are you going to talk about golf also? I met a gentleman from Argentina in New York. We were in the same meeting, and I said, you know, I have a friend of mine who's ambassador in Argentina. He said, oh, the golfing ambassador. That's your reputation. Didn't do any serious work there. Basically enjoyed himself. So just listen to him, enjoy yourself, because I think he's enjoying himself. And this is a wonderful title, The Journey of an Innocent Indian Who Eats Beef, by the way. Only Latin American beef, because there are no holy cows in Latin America. The holy cows are only in India. You notice that I have read some parts of your book. And so over to you. Come. Ambassador Viswanathan.
Good evening. A wet and wild evening to talk about the hot and steamy Latin America.
You tell them the story of the 72-year-old and the 27-year-old.
My Latin American journey started in Brazil in 1996. I was 44 years old and I was still innocent. I was swept off my feet by the samba culture of Brazil. I was so excited. I wanted to write a book then itself about Latin America. But my Brazilian friends advised me against it. They said, don't be foolish. Don't waste this age in writing books. This is the age for action and to gather experience. They said you should write after the age of 60. And they explained it with a story in a typical Brazilian way. They said, men are like birds. Between the age of 20 and 30, they are like crows. They eat anything and everything. Between the age of 40 and 60, they are like eagles. They choose what they eat. Between the age of 60 and 80, they are like parrots. They talk more than they eat. And above 80, they are like condor up there in the hills. But in Portuguese, it means con means with, dor means pain. Condor aqui, pain here, pain there. I ended my Latin American journey on 31st of May this year in Buenos Aires. I was 60 years old and I was no longer innocent. But my Argentine friends gave me an advice. They said, don't stop having fun when you are old. You become old only when you stop having fun. So my message to my like-minded friends who are inclined to travel is that you should visit Latin America. You should make your own journeys to Latin America, and you will come back happier and younger. Now, this is not just my theory. I have evidence, historical evidence. In 1924, there was an Indian who made a journey to Latin America. An Indian, not so innocent, but illustrious Indian, reached Buenos Aires on 6th November 1924. He was 63 years old. He stayed in Buenos Aires for 2 months till 3rd January 1925. And he was rejuvenated. He felt like a 34-year-old. The secret was 34 years old, an Argentine beauty, Victoria Ocampo. And the illustrious Indian is Rabindranath Tagore. He wrote many letters to her, dozens of letters. In one of the letters, he said, "We were of unequal age, but I was not aware of the difference." He wrote a series of poems on her, calling her as Victoria, calling her as Dear Vijaya, my Balobasa. Balobasa, is that correct? Dear Victoria, my Balobasa. This bunch of poems is called Purabi. In one of the poems, he writes, "Oh, exotic blossom, I asked, what is your language, dear? You smiled and shook your head, and the leaves murmured instead." One day, Victoria Ocampo saw Tagore trying to sketch something, and she said, "Dear Gurudev, you have talent for painting. You must start painting." So Tagore looked up to her and said, "Really?" And she gave a deal. She said, "You make painting seriously. I will organize the exhibition of your paintings." And she did. In 1930 in Paris, with her own money and with her own contacts, she organized Tagore's painting exhibitions. So when old people go to Latin America, they come back happier and younger and write books and poems. So what do the young people do? They don't waste their time. There is a chapter in my book. It's called as "The Risk of Doing Business with Latin America." The risk of doing business with Colombia is falling in love. There are these 3 Indian guys, youngsters. They went to do an IT project for MICES in Bogota. Promptly, they fell in love with 3 Colombian girls. Married, settled there, and they started their own company called Sofo Solutions, which is doing extremely well in IT. My journey to Latin America started from Malgudi. As you know, Malgudi is the fictional small town in the novels of R.K. Narayan. The Malgudians are stereotyped as people who are innocent, simple, religious, conservative, traditional, and very serious. They are so serious that if you have to make a Malgudian laugh on a Friday, you have to tell them a joke on Monday. They would need 5 days to process it, understand, analyze, reflect, and then decide to laugh. Now, Macondo is the fictional town in the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian Nobel Prize winner. The stereotype of characters in Macondo are magical realism. Now, you want to know what is magical realism? I asked a Venezuelan guy once, "Amigo, are you married?" He looked at me with a mischievous smile and said, "Más o menos," which means more or less. I didn't understand whether he was more married or more than married, less married or less than married. In my journey from Malgudi to Macondo, I imbibed the spirit of Latin America and discovered a new Latin America, politically and economically. This Latin American spirit, to me, is illustrated in this pop song from Argentina, my favorite Argentine pop singer called Axel Fernando. It's called Celebra la Vida, celebrate life. The song goes like this: Celebra la vida, segundo a segundo, nada se guarda, todo se brinda. Celebrate life from second to second. Don't hold anything. Give out everything. That is the spirit of Latin America. Now, I will illustrate this Latin American spirit with 3 stories: a literary story, a filmy story, and a real-life story. The literary story is in a novel called Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter by Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru, who won the Nobel Prize. In this novel, the hero is an 18-year-old boy. One day, his aunt lands up from Bolivia in his house, where he lives with his parents. And this Bolivian aunt has become a widow at the age of 36. So she comes and stays with this hero's parents. So the parents of this boy tell him, "Son, this poor aunt is very sad and depressed. Why don't you take her out, take her to theaters, films, and cheer her up?" And he tries to do that reluctantly. And the aunt treats him like all the aunts, treats him like a kid. And it frustrates him even more. But then he perseveres and takes her out every day. And in the course of doing that, the inevitable happens. He falls in love with her and declares his love. But the aunt doesn't believe. She says, "Kid, this is just infatuation. It will go away tomorrow when you meet other young girls." But he continues, and then one day says that, "I want to marry you." She laughs at him and says, "What? You want to marry me? 18-year-old boy married to a 36-year-old woman? You will be the laughing stock." You won't survive. And you would leave me at the sight of the first young girl. But he persists. Finally, one day she faces him and says, hey, you say that you are in real love with me and you want to marry me. Suppose we marry. How long do you think you will stay with me and we will live happily together? This young boy of 18 years old, he doesn't think. He just says, 2 years. The aunt says, 2 years? Fantastic. It's worthwhile. Let's get married. And they marry. That is the Latin American spirit. If the marriage is worth for 2 years, yes, let's marry. There is the other story, filmy story. There is a film, Colombian film, called Embajador de la India. It means the ambassador of India, the real name. In this film, the hero is traveling in a rural bus and is sleeping and gets up and feels like smoking. He takes out his cigarette, but there's no match. So he taps the guy at the back and says, amigo, can you lend me a match? So that guy gives him the match, but then looks at him and says, hey, your accent is different. Where are you from? This guy is a big crook. He looks at him and says, yo soy de la India. I am from India. I said, India? What are you doing here in rural Colombia? This guy says, yo soy embajador de la India. I am the ambassador of India. So the other guy, they laughs. He says, what? It's a joke. You say you're ambassador of India? What are you doing traveling in this bus with us? And this crook says, yo soy embajador de la India incognito. I am here to understand, mix with people. So people buy the story, and when they reach the little town, they put him up in the lodge and have parties every day and has a great time spinning stories about India. Until one day, one of his other crooks, accomplices, he comes and spills the beans. So he's caught. Now, if it happens in India, what would people have done? Indians have done. They would have beaten him up, lynched him, called him the police. What did the Colombians do? They said, hey, you took us all for a royal ride. Let's have a fiesta. Then there is a real life story. In December 2008, there was a huge strike in Buenos Aires airport. And 3-4 days, flights were not operating, some were operating. It was a huge strike. And the Argentines, you know their temperament. They went and broke the glasses, broke the counters, threw stones. It was a total mess. I went to see off my son. I used my diplomatic privilege to get in. I reached the lounge for Sao Paulo. So while there was chaos and anger and frustration and noise and damage all over the airport, in that lounge where the Brazilians were sitting, there were about 70, 80 of them. You know what they were doing? They were drinking, singing, and dancing. They had all missed their, they didn't have their flight. They were waiting for 3 hours flight for 2 days. But they all singing and dancing and collecting money from everyone, buying whiskey from the duty-free shop. Now, this is the spirit of Latin Americans. Let me make one correction. The stories, I told you the first one, literary story and the filmy story, they were also real life stories. The first story, literary story of this 18-year-old boy who married 36-year-old, it is the real life story of Mario Vargas Llosa himself, who at one time was a candidate to be a president of Peru. And the second one, the movie, Embajador de la India, it was also based on a real life story. So that is the magical realism. Now, I don't want to talk only about the fun part, the dance and music of Latin American spirit. They also have a serious spirit of innovation, entrepreneurship, and a spirit of the society to work collectively and to put their act together and achieve things. I'll just give you 3 examples. There's a chapter in this book called Agriculture Process Outsourcing, APO, like a BPO, KPO, by an Argentine Patel. This is a guy called Gustavo Grobako Patel, whom you met. It's a dear friend of mine. His company farms 270,000 hectares of land in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and part of Bolivia. He doesn't own a single hectare of land. Everything is leased. He gives 1/3 of the produce to the owners. He doesn't own a single tractor, single harvester, any machine. Everything is outsourced. He doesn't pay the agronomists. Each agronomist takes care of 5,000 hectares of land, and they get a percentage of the production. And even the capital which he uses is not his. That's also outsourced. The funds they have invested in. So he has innovated this new practice of agriculture process outsourcing, connecting the owners of the land, the service providers, and including the commodity traders, everyone in a virtual chain, adding value to everyone, adding to production. And this is the new business model, and this is the one innovated in Argentina, and it has gone to other countries including United States. Entrepreneurial spirit. There is a chapter in this book about a Brazilian called Cecilia Clelia. Now this Cecilia was working in an Indian shop in London. And the Indian, the owner, he fell for the Brazilian. So she brought him to Sao Paulo. And they married. And they lived together. But she wanted to do some business with India. So she started the business of importing henna products from India, distributing to local market. It became successful. Then she started importing only the ingredients and made her own brand, her own products, and marketed in Brazil. It became successful. Then she started exporting to many countries, including India. She exports over $1 million of henna products with her brand. It's called Surya Henna, to India. And she's going beyond that. She wants to start a plant here in India to make henna products to export to other countries. That is the enterprising spirit. Now, about the collective spirit of putting the act together, I'll give you one example. In the 70s and 80s, India and Brazil were in the same level, same situation of oil imports. We were producing, actually the opposite. We were producing 70% and importing 30%. In the case of Brazil, it was the opposite. Then the Brazilians innovated. They went for this fuel ethanol program. Today, almost all the cars produced in Brazil, they run on flexi fuel engines. They have reduced the petrol consumption by 30% using this ethanol program. How did they do it? They did it by getting all the players together and reaching a consensus. The farmers, the farm lobbies, the producers of ethanol, distillers, the car companies, the oil companies, And today they are the global leader and pioneer in use of fuel ethanol, which has not only reduced their import of petrol, it is also a cleaner fuel. It's cleaner than the corn ethanol from United States and more effective. Well, we were talking about introducing 5% ethanol, but we've been talking and talking. Now, I talked about the Latin American spirit. Let me tell you something about the Latin America as a region, what I call as the new Latin America. Latin America has undergone a paradigm shift. It has undergone fundamental changes politically, economically, socially, and culturally. And I tell our people, the business people, don't read history books, throw them away. I tell them this Mexican ballad which says, "No me preguntas más, déjanos imaginar que no existe el pasado, que nos conocimos cuando encontramos," which means, don't ask me anymore. Let us imagine that the past did not exist. Let's imagine that we were born when we got to know each other. That is the new Latin America. Now, politically, in the past, the region was known for political instability and military dictatorship. And the region was in a turmoil because of vertical polarization between the left and the right, between the radicals and the conservatives, between the dictators and guerrillas. But now, in the last 2 decades, this gap is narrowing, and they are moving towards the consensus, towards the center, with pragmatic policies, pro-poor and pro-business, market-friendly and inclusive development. But in this, it is not 50-50, it is 60-40. Pro-poor is 60% and 40% is pro-business. Now, with this consensus policy, over 50 million Latin Americans have been brought out of poverty line. They have joined the middle class. So the middle class is growing, emerging stronger. And I believe this emerging stronger and bigger middle class is the insurance for political stability and maturity in the years to come. This new growth model, development model, I call it as Brasilia consensus as against Washington consensus. Washington consensus made Latin America lose a decade in the 80s. It's called the last decades. The Brasilia consensus has given rise to a growth decade in this decade. Now, the evidence that this is the dominant trend, this is the way Latin America is moving, although there are exceptions, glaring exceptions, is that, I'll give you 2 examples. In Uruguay, in 2005, someone called Mujica stood for election to presidency. He was a guerrilla. He was in jail for 14 years, including 1 year in a deep well, dry well. When he stood for presidency, so people thought, the business people, the right-wing media said, oh, this guerrilla is going to come and take revenge. He will not be suitable to run the country. And you know what he said? He said, I'm going to be like Lula. I'm going to follow the Brasilia consensus, moderate centrist policies. He was elected. Then there is this person called Ollanta Humala from Peru. First time when he stood for elections, he lost because he was like Chavez. Second time, he got Brazilian advisors who told him, follow this model. He promised to the Peruvians, I'll be like Lula. I will follow the Brasilia consensus. He has been elected. He is the president now. A word about the external policy of Latin America. You know, in the past, this internal polarization gave the opening for external interference. Monroe Doctrine, and Latin America was called as the backyard of some other country. No longer, because as the gap narrows as they are moving towards consensus, they give less opportunity for external interference. And the Latin Americans have smartly started building firewalls, which are called as the regional groups. Mercosur, Andean Community, SICA of Central America, UNASUR, now the latest one, CELAC. Now, these are all regional groups which have been formed not only for collective economic prosperity and collective stability, but also as a collective insurance for security. For example, you know the story of Noriega, who was picked up from the presidential palace in Panama and put in jail in US. They cannot do it to Chavez tomorrow because he's part of Mercosur. So this is the insurance he has got and the Mercosur has got. So I asked a Brazilian friend of mine, how is the state of relations between Brazil and the United States? As usual, he told me a story. He said, there was a Texan guy who visited Copacabana and Ipanema and fell in love with a garota de Ipanema, the girl from Ipanema. Married her and took her to Texas. And once he reached there, he called her, said, come, sit down. I will explain to you the rules of our marriage. 3 rules. Number 1, I'm the boss. Number 2, I will go out anytime I like, do anything I like, no questions. Number 3, as and when I come back home, there is 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock at the night, the food should be ready, warm, on the table. So this Texan macho asked this Brazilian girl, yeah? You have any reaction? You have any comments, conditions? She said, no, nothing. I have just only one small comment to make. Oh, what's that? She tells him, you see the bedroom there? There will be sex in the bedroom every night at 10 o'clock, whether you are there or not. So this is how Latin Americans deal with the United States. A word about the economic stability. You know, in the olden days, you had IMF cases, Brazil, Argentina, many countries. They all used to go to the executive director of IMF, trembling, asking for rescue packages, and IMF used to put conditions. But now there is a role reversal. In December 2011, when Christine Lagarde went to Brasilia, she was the one who was trembling when she was meeting President Dilma, because she was asking for money from Brazil for rescuing Europe. And Dilma said, yes, we'll give the money, but 2 conditions. 1, you must reform IMF. 2, you must tell the wretched Europeans that they must behave, they must be disciplined, they must exercise fiscal prudence. These were the words used by the other side to Latin America in the past. Now they are giving it back. Now, the reason why they are giving it back is because Latin America, the Latin American policymakers are exercising fiscal discipline and prudence consistently in this decade. Just to give you 2 examples. The fiscal deficit in the case of Latin America in 2011 was 0.3%. In 2010, they had a primary surplus of 0.3%. In this decade, the deficit has been under 2%. In Europe, it is over 4%. In the case of UK and Spain, it's over 8%. In the case of United States, it is 8%. Let's take the case of debt. Debt as a percentage of GDP in the case of Latin America is 28%. In the case of Europe, it is 87%. In the case of United States, it's 100%. Now you tell me who is fiscally prudent and disciplined. This is the new scenario. In the olden days, Latin America had hyperinflation, 3,000% even in 1989-90. In those days, there was a joke. You know, one can never say exactly the figure of Latin American inflation and Indian population. By the time you finish the sentence, both would have gone up. But now, the Latin American inflation has been in single digit in the last decade, in any case, much lower than in India. If you look at the growth rates, Latin America grew by 6% in 2010, 4.7% in 2011, and this year 3.5% plus. Despite the global crisis, Latin American economic, the macroeconomic fundamentals have not only become stronger, the economies have become resilient and resistant to external shocks. That is why I bet on this new Latin America, which can sustain its political stability and economic growth in the decades to come. What does this new Latin America has to offer for us, India? I'll just give you only two examples. One is energy security, the other one is food security. We have been importing over 300,000 barrels of oil per day from Latin America, which is 10% of our imports. We are going to need more, and Latin America has the potential to produce more. Today, Brazil produces 2.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, they are going to produce 5 million barrels. Mexico, with this new government, are going to invest, do a bit of privatization, they are going to increase production. Colombia, which was producing only 500,000 barrels per day, is now producing 1 million barrels per day. So you have more production of oil in Latin America. Besides that, there is shale gas. You know the story of shale gas in the United States, which is a game changer. It brought down the price of gas from $16 to $2. Now, Argentina has the third largest shale gas reserves in the world after US and China, and they have an advantage. Unlike in US and China, where shale gas is in the inhabited places where there are people and cities, here it is in Patagonia. So without touching people, you can get everything. So Latin America can contribute oil, energy to our energy security, oil and natural shale gas. Now, food security. Now, while we are self-sufficient in rice and wheat and the staples, we have perennial shortage of edible oil. In 2000, we imported something like about 3 million tons of edible oil. This year, last season, we imported 9.5 million tons. By 2020, it's going to be about 15 million tons. Now, our capacity to increase production is limited. The demand is more. Now, we have been importing about $2 billion worth of soya oil and sunflower oil from Argentina. And we can get more. Brazil is producing, Paraguay is producing. So as we need more, they have the capacity to give us. Second, as and when monsoon hits us, when we have shortage, like we had shortage in 2008-9 of sugar we got from Brazil. In 2007-8, there was a bit of shortage of wheat we imported from Argentina. So as and when you need these kind of things, here there is a place. And lastly, pulses. We import about 3 million tons of pulses from Canada, Myanmar, and Australia and Turkey. Now, our production of pulses hasn't significantly increased from the days of 1950. Now, Latin America, South America is emerging as a new source where they can grow pulses and export to India. Our friend Gustavo Grovo Patel has already sent his first shipment to India. Now, I say that this new Latin America has synergies and complementarities with India. I call this synergy as the synergy between bindi and bikini, spiritual energy and sensual energy. Now, in Brazil, they say the speech has to be like a bikini, short enough to arouse interest and a bit long enough to cover the areas of interest. I'm afraid my speech has been like a Malgudi Kanchipuram sari of 9 yards. I would like to thank Mr. Tarun Das and the Aspen Institute, and he said there would be question and answer session. I tell you, I am no longer a diplomat, I am an ex-diplomat, so I can talk to you frankly. You know, they say diplomats are people who think twice before saying nothing. I will not think twice to answer your questions. Thank you.